So let's talk about the rules for the Spiky Knight households of Warhammer 40k, talking through the new army rule detachments and datasheets from Codex Chaos Knights. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights, and in this video we're doing a full overview of the Codex's core rules, with changes to the army rule detachments and datasheets. For initial impressions of this one, I feel like there is some interesting strength here, though it doesn't really feel like a particularly feels-good update. Plenty of the detachment rules are interesting, though it feels like the army rule might have a bit of a reversion to taking effect a bit late in the game, and plenty of the datasheets do feel like downgrades in one way or another. Hopefully a bit of initial pessimism isn't quite as bad as people are thinking right now, particularly after Games Workshop's adjusted points and any early balance updates they do for the book. For the contents of the rules though, they have all the standard things that you'd expect to find in normal 10th edition codexes. They've got the lore and miniature galleries, the crusade content, though instead of combat patrol rules they have a heraldry section in there. They did make some combat patrol rules that they've got available to download on the Warhammer community downloads page though if you want to, basically fielding a pair of war dogs. For this review though, as with my normal ones, I'm going to focus on the core rules for the faction, so that's the main rule and the supporting rules to that one, plus the 4 detachments in the book and the 11 datasheets, including the new Knight Ruinator. On top of those, there's also some supporting rules for super heavy walkers and the way that they move around, and fielding knights as allies, and I'll mention both of those early on. There is a point section in the book as usual, but these generally tend to be outdated. Just about every single one seems to have big revisions compared with when the book publishes. I will certainly look to cover those on the channel when they come out though. If you're looking to pick up the Codex or any of the Chaos Knight stuff from over the weekend, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers around the world. There'll be links down in the video description. And if you're watching the video in the first 24 hours or so after it comes out, these will be the times when they go live at the various different stores around the world, ranging from midnight Eastern Time in North America, and then between 10 AM and midday for locations around the rest of the world. As ever, a big thank you to anyone picking things up via those links. It does help to support the channel and keep the videos coming. Let's jump straight into it though, and we'll start out with the core army rule, Harbingers of Dread, and then the 2 supporting rules with Super Heavy Walker and Dreadblades. In Warhammer 40k, a lot of the backstory and the rules mechanics of Chaos Knights have generally tended to be great big fallen nobles that project an ominous pall of dread and despair, often sending foes fleeing before them as they tear apart their ranks. This one's had a revision from the index, and it basically seems to have reverted to a mechanic that gets better throughout the game, starting out with some morale debuffs active, and then going on towards the end of the game to have a whole bunch of them off a table. The way it works is that the Deathly Terror debuff is active from the start of the game, and that one gives you -1 leadership to enemy units within 9 inches, and then there's a table numbered 1 to 6 of 6 more of them, and over the course of the game you can try and gradually activate them, so you potentially have an entire table worth of debuffs active by turn 5. The way they activate is at the start of battle rounds 1, 3 and 5, and then for each of those you have a choice, either selecting one dread ability out of that list of 1 to 6, and that one becomes active, or you can randomly roll 2 dice, and the 2 corresponding numbers become active instead. Annoyingly enough, it looks like if you roll a duplicate result, say one that you already had active, or if you roll 2 dice and they hit the same result, then you don't get an additional one. It just means that you might wind up with 1 random buff active as opposed to 2, which does feel a little bit unnecessarily punishing to me. If you're activating them randomly, it might be kind of nice to allow you to re-roll duplicate results. It just means 1 in every 6 games. If you're going randomly from turn 1, then you're going to only get 1 active if you want to go for the double roll. In any case, this is the list of abilities that you can get active. The first one is Despair, and that's an extra -1 leadership within 9 inches, and that does stack with the original Deathly Terror one. So that means that when enemies are testing leadership and battle shock and things, they'll be at -2, not 1. That one feels more like an amplifier one to the others, as opposed to one that you want to go for straight away, as it's only going to matter if you cause battle shock tests, and then some of the rest of the table can actually make those battle shock tests more meaningful. One of those is the Doom one, and if the target of your attacks is battle shocked, he gets to add +1 to the wound roll with your Chaos Knights against it. That one is nice enough in a good direct damage increase. You just need to make sure that you can cause the battle shock test. You can do it with certain stratagems and things, or the Knight Abhorrent, but that would be a pretty nice damage buff if so. It might just not be super meaningful on infantry sort of targets if you're wounding them on a 2+ anyway though. Then number 3, and probably one of the most easily useful ones, is Darkness. If enemies attacking your knights are greater than 18 inches away, or they're battle shocked, then they're -1 to hit your knights. That seems that could be a very strong contender for just choosing turn 1 against a gunline army. It means that early in the game effectively your knights get stealth pretty much, never mind any units that happen to get battle shocked, and they also get less good at killing your knights. It's going to be far more meaningful against gunline armies as opposed to dedicated melee ones, but that seems to be a really strong pick against those. For number 4, we've got Dismay. This is the one where enemies within 9 inches must test Battle Shock in the enemy command phase if they're below starting strength, so not below half strength. This previously was the detachment rule for the Traitoris Lance, and it was a big part of making Battle Shock tests actually more relevant for the faction. Maybe a little bit annoying that it wasn't just part of the core faction rule potentially. It would be quite nice to have that active right from the word go. It sort of feels like the one that does make the rule a lot more impactful, but also it's still not all that good on its own without other actual buffs and debuffs to back it up. Number 5 is Delirium, probably one of the weakest. When enemies below half strength are within 9 inches, if they fail a Battle Shock test, take D3 mortal wounds. It's definitely not nothing, and it does mean that if you can cause Battle Shock tests, then the enemy will be at a higher chance of failing, and when they do, they'll take some mortal wounds. That one feels a bit on the situational side to me, but just every so often it'll do something and maybe do something relevant. And then finally for the 6th one, that's Dominion, and that gives you plus 3 inches to your aura abilities. So I guess all these dread abilities will be going out to 12 inches, and it would also help with things like War Dog buffs, which most of the Abhorrent class ones have one. Overall, between all that, there's definitely some interesting ones. It feels like easily the one to get reliable value out of is the Darkness one for the -1 to hit at long range. That just looks like it's going to be useful for most knights, provided the opponent's got at least some guns, and might help out with Battle Shock units later on. The majority of the rest of the rule just feels like it's got the previous problem of not really getting good until a bit too late in the game. It feels like if you want to combo multiple Battle Shock debuffs and then actually have them do something, that's probably going to be turn 3 at the earliest, and by the time it gets to turn 5 it's just not going to be all that good. Feels like maybe the choice turn 1 is whether or not to deliberately buy in the Darkness one, unless your opponent's just a fairly heavy melee force that you don't think it's going to be all that impactful. And if that one's not that great, I'd probably be tempted to roll 2 for them, and then maybe pick the one on the 3rd battle round to try and actually make the overall combo useful. I definitely don't like the being unable to reroll duplicate things though, and to me it does feel like a shame that this one's just not quite as impactful as you might hope it would be outside of Darkness if you're not playing the Traitoris Lance. Otherwise, for core knightly rules, we've got the Super Heavy Walker rule. This one's basically unchanged from the index, and when it became a thing, it basically gave the Titanic Knights the datasheet rule to allow them to smash through terrain. Titanic Knights are able to move over other models that aren't Titanic models, move through terrain features that are less than 4 inches in height, and it counts the actual specific segment that you're going through, so it might mean that you can move through part of a terrain feature but not the tall bit. And then you do have the option still to move through the tall bits of terrain as well. You just have a 1 in 6 chance of becoming battle shocked, which could be kind of important as you wouldn't be able to use stratagems or contest objectives. Most of the time though, you'll be fine. I think this was really quite a good rule to help make the big knights become more relevant. They had the possibility of just being a bit too easy to move block previously. And this one basically means that you can have them hidden behind a great big tall ruin if you want to, and then burst out in a very direct way to go towards the foe and make their presence felt. Bear in mind that you can't use this in the charge phase, it is just in the movement phase with normal advance and fallback moves. When you're actually charging things, you will be going into the things that you can see and not being able to move straight through ruins. Overall though, glad this one stayed. It is a good part in keeping the Titanic Knights a bit more playable. Then finally, for core rule things, we've got the Dreadblade Allies. This one again seems to be unchanged from the index, and you can use 1 Titanic Knight or 1 to 3 War Dogs in other Chaos Army lists, so join things like your Death Guard or your Emperor's Children or Chaos Demons or Chaos Space Marines. As ever, these knights may not be your Warlord, and it does mean that you're basically getting just the datasheet rules for the knight, as you won't get any knightly specific stratagems, you won't get the Harbingers of Dread, and you wouldn't be able to take enhancements on them. But at least in the past this hasn't stopped War Dogs in particular being quite a strong choice to add to armies. Just the raw datasheet strength of the Carnivore and the Brigand have often showed up in other lists. It feels like if Carnivores stay a similar sort of points cost, I feel like that's still going to be the case. War Dogs are going to be a bit easier to kill now, but the Carnivore still seems to have pretty equal damage to what it had before. And pre-Codex, it was one of the most efficient units into the biggest amount of profiles out there in Warhammer 40k point for point without buffs. Occasionally they can have some interesting synergy with other armies out there though. Say for example, going into Death Guard weakened units that have been hit by contagions, they tend to work on knights as well, so could have some excess value there. I'm glad that this one stuck around intact though. Quite a lot of allies rules have been toned down a bit, but there is something pretty awesome about having a great big fallen noble joining along another Chaos army. Core rules aside though, let's get into the detachments, and in Codex Chaos Knights there's 4 of them. The Traitoris Lance, which is the index style one, a fairly balanced one for big knights and war dogs, and that one doubles down on the dread rules and the battle shock style shenanigans, trying to make them more useful and more impactful. The Infernal Lance, on the other hand, is a bit of a nod back to demon-possessed knights. They have a pretty fun mechanic that's somewhat similar to Dark Pacts, with the ability to get extra damage, movement or durability, and a few more things that add raw strength to knights. Then there's the Lords of Dread, which is the Titanic Knight focused one. Nobles striding out there for personal glory to lay the enemy low. The War Dog's not really getting much support. And then there's the opposite of that in the Houndpack Lance. This one's the very War Dog focused one, as we've seen far too much of in competitive lists recently. A big pack of the War Dog Knights turned out to hunt down their prey. On top of that, they can also use their Iconoclast Fiefdom Grotmus detachment. That's the one where you basically get to sacrifice Chaos Cultists for damage buffs and sort of feed them into the Gatling cannons of the Knight Despoilers perhaps. There is definitely some interest there, and some big shooting knights can hit very hard. Having access to Cultists isn't the worst either, though in general it didn't really see much play versus the Traitoris Lance. Bear in mind that you can also still field allied demons in your army, up to a quarter of your army with datasheets from Index Chaos Demons. You need to field one battle line unit per one other deity unit that you have in the index. And in general, it's tended to mean that the Nurgle things are really quite popular. Both Nurglings and Plague Bearers are pretty much in demand. Nurglings for infiltrating and Plague Bearers for their sticky objectives rule. And they could unlock some other Nurgle datasheets like maybe say Beasts, which are quite nice for cheap scouty units. Basically in an army where all your units are 100 points or more, it's quite nice to be able to access some small chaff things that are far less. Some armies have gone heavy on the allied demons for other stuff as well, maybe getting some big greater demons in the mix for another big threat to tank a bunch of damage alongside the knights. Getting into the detachments properly though, and first up we have the Traitoris Lance. As mentioned, this one's the sort of balanced Chaos Knight Lance, doubling down on their trope of Bringers of Doom and Despair, and playing into the Harbingers of Dread rule more than most. The core rule is called Paragons of Terror, and this one basically means that you get more Dread abilities faster after you've generated the Dread abilities, either by rolling for 2 of them or selecting one. You get to select an additional one, so you could see the random ones that you've rolled and then pick another one if you'd like. Given the kind of late activation otherwise, this one seems like it's the one that's needed to make the stacking Battleshock debuffs work, ideally forcing more tests, making those tests harder to pass, and then getting the actual damage and defense debuffs up nice and early. I feel like I'd be quite tempted to roll 2 of them and then see what you get, and then maybe go for the -1 to hit outside of 18 inches if you haven't rolled that and it's relevant. Though if you have managed to get it, you could think about something else and try and tailor it to the foe or what you've rolled. That way you'd basically start the battle with 4 Dread abilities active unless you've got unlucky and doubled up. It just seems that overall there'd be a good amount more chance that it might actually take some effect in the early game. Then at the start of Battle Round 3, I guess you'd choose 2 more, so most of the time by that point you'd have 5 of the 6 Dread abilities active, and you would have picked 3 of them, so you'd probably have the ones that you want easily by now. It still maybe feels like a side grade versus the Index one though, maybe more abilities later in the game, but the Index one had basically started with the -1 at the test if below starting strength, and also the +1 to wound and -1 to hit ones. Perhaps feels like a side grade from that. I guess at least you do get the -1 to hit at greater than 18 inches away, which the Index didn't have. Getting into the stratagems for the Traitoris Lance though, probably the first thing to say is that Diabolic Bulwark has gone off to the Infernal Lance. That's kind of a shame as a pretty staple one for knights in general, being able to rotate Iron Shields to get a 4+ invulnerable save. That was really quite an easy option to do and often made sense, particularly on the big knights. Still plenty of interesting ones though. Terror Shades is still here. And this one seems the same as it was before. If the enemy fails the Battleshock test within 12 inches of you, you roll 6d6. For each 4+ they take a mortal wound, and the knight that triggered it can heal the same amount if it's lost wounds already. You can only use it once per battle round. It is situational, and you're never going to be able to guarantee the opponent fails any one Battleshock test, but when it happens it's really quite nice being able to both sap health from the enemy and potentially kill things, and also regenerate valuable knight wounds. It can be a really solid swing in terms of damaging the enemy while healing you. For 1 command point, there's Conquerors Without Mercy. This one gives you an AP boost on the charge, so you could have things like AP3 sweep profiles on a Warp Strike Claw, or maybe get up to AP4 for a Chain Talon or Slaughter Claw if it makes sense. And then while you make your attacks, if you destroy an enemy unit, enemies within 6 inches must test Battleshock. The melee boost I'd say is okay. Most knightly weapons have a good amount of AP anyway. It's going to depend on the unit and the target in question. The Battleshock timing is maybe a bit unhelpful besides helping out nearby melees happening. It just seems like that's not really going to be a major focus for this one. You both need to have combats happening side by side, and then the opponent actually needs to fail the Battleshock test if it's going to have impact for the buffs that you might or might not have active. It feels like this one will be used for the AP thing, and if it happens to do Battleshock things that are actually useful, then all well and good I suppose. For 1 command point, there's Disdain for the Weak. This one's again similar to the Index, a 6+ feel no pain in the fight phase, boosted to a 5+ against Battleshock models making attacks against you. Still maybe a shame that it's not able to be used against things in the shooting phase. The 6+ feel no pain one is okay on a Titanic Knight against a unit that's going to hit it seriously hard. Feels like you could save enough wounds worth of health to be able to make that justified. It feels like it gets a fair bit more impressive for the 5+ result though, but that's very dependent on the foe actually being Battleshocked in the first place, which often they won't be. Next up, we've got a long leash, which looks like it's been reduced from the index. One Abhorrent Knight counts 2 War Dogs as being within aura range of it, even if they're further away than 9 inches. It lasts from your command phase to your next command phase. I felt like this one was maybe a tiny bit on the borderline yield side already. Only affecting 2 War Dogs doesn't help with that. I guess you could be getting things like Carnivores rerolling 1s to hit, or the same for a couple of War Dog Brigands perhaps. The Knight Ruinator gets an AP buff, which could be nice enough for things like War Dog Executioners, though it does all depend on the big knights being worth it to put on the board in their own right. I feel like you'd struggle to justify buying them in for this, and even then you could still try and keep them within aura range so you don't have to use it. For 1 command point, there's Imperious Advance, and that's just the new name for the walk-through wall stratagem it would seem. 2 War Dogs or 1 Titanic Knight can move through models and terrain features, and models can auto-pass Desperate Escape tests, and while doing so you don't have to test the Battle Shock test that you might have to do for Super Heavy Walker rule if you're moving through tall terrain. In general, I guess, unless you need to jump to the other side of a Titanic model, it seems like it would be a waste to use this on a Titanic Knight. Probably just roll the Battle Shock unless it's absolutely game critical or something. In general, this still feels like the one way you'd want to set up War Dogs behind terrain and have them strike out from a place of safety to a long way across the board. Could be really nice for War Dog Carnivores still. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Storm of Darkness, and this one seems to be the reactive durability boost that's replaced the Diabolic Bulwark, and this one gives a Chaos Knight stealth and cover in the shooting phase. It is maybe a bit weird that with the Traitoris lance, you're probably already going to be -1 to hit at greater than 18 inches away, so the stealth might not always take much effect. Cover is kind of easy to come by in 10th edition as well, particularly for great big models like Chaos Knights. Still though, I guess if a knight had to move out to hold an objective or something, then it still might be relevant. Definitely still doesn't feel quite as good as Diabolic Bulwark the majority of the time though. I feel like that was just a bit more reliably good against big heavy anti-tank weapons that you want to use reactive durability things on. But there'd definitely be occasions that this one is absolutely well worth it, particularly when you get to take advantage of both the -1 to hit and the cover, say from a big scary shooting unit firing up close. Then finally we've got the enhancements. None of these are limited to any one chassis, so I guess you could take them on things like the Cerastus Knights if you wanted to. Bear in mind though that War Dog Stalkers aren't characters anymore, so outside of Houndpack Lance you're not going to be taking any enhancements on them. That also means that you're going to need to have at least 1 Titanic Knight leading this force. First up, we've got Nightmare's Master. Enemy units within engagement range must test Battle Shock at the start of the fight phase. Potentially, if you have the Dread buffs going, that could equate to a +1 to wound and a -1 to hit if they fail, and they are more likely to fail with the -1 leadership compared with some armies. In the index, that one was called Lord of Dread, and it was 15 points. Definitely not unusable as a point filler on a big knight if it's cheap enough. Tyrant's Shadow is a sticky objective style one. At the end of the command phase, 1 objective control becomes a sticky objective, and that one remains yours until your opponent controls it at the end of any phase. While the objective remains yours, it also gains the Deathly Terror Dread ability, so the -1 leadership aura to 9 inches if enemies get close but not so close that they actually take it from you. That one's called Aura of Terror in the index. It's quite a popular one to buy in. Previously it was 25 points. Still seems well worth having to mark an objective and move on. Perfectly usable on the big knight still, I think. Next up, we've got Malevolent Heraldry. This one allows you to reroll any or both dice when you're randomly selecting dread abilities. I guess how useful that is might depend on whether you're even thinking about randomly selecting them in the first place. You do get an additional one and still get your choice of ones after that, so it seems reasonable enough. I guess you could use it to minimise the chance of you getting a duplicate roll, so at least you get 2 dread abilities the vast majority of the time. Or if you happen to roll 2 ones that you really don't think are going to be helpful early game, you could get those re-rolled. Finally, there's a good durability one called the Veil of Medrungard, and I feel like this one's probably going to be the first go-to one for most people. You might not have Diabolic Bulwark, but this one just gives you a 4+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks the vast majority of the time, and also a 5+ against melee as well, which is very nice, as that perhaps more often tends to be where big knights tend to die quickly. Provided that's a reasonable points cost, that seems like a very easy pickup, particularly for a knight that's rushing down the enemy and on the front lines. That could be very nice for something like a Rampager to have similar sort of durability to the Knight Lancers. Overall for the detachment, it feels like it's not so very different from the index. A few positive things, but definitely some negatives. The loss of Diabolic Bulwark feels like maybe the single biggest nerf out of it to me. It's just really handy to have that sort of reactive durability on tap against enemy shooting. Otherwise, perhaps the single biggest win might be that Veil of Medrungard enhancement. Just getting boosted invulnerable saves for a tanky knight all the time is exactly what they usually tend to want. That could be a very annoying knight to take down when comboed with the -1 to hit from the army rule potentially at long range. Before we move on to the other 3 detachments, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, In Melted Minis. They're run by Kaya Commission Painter based in the UK, who can paint individual 40k models or squads that specialise in monsters and chaos knights, including his rather spectacular work as you can see over the next few slides. They're also running a really generous giveaway at the moment with a chance to win a Knight Castigator. In general, the idea is that with commission painters, you basically have an idea for a project, message them what you had in mind, and they can come back with a quote for you. They have a rough price list, that depending on the exact things that you like for a project, things could vary quite a bit depending on the extra work that might be wanted. For example, they usually tend to have different levels of painting. Say for example, this is standard level on the left versus the prestige one with a whole bunch of awesome object source lighting and some nice blood spatters and effects. He also seems to enjoy his lava bases as well. Apparently that's a much requested one after they've seen them on showcase models like this. I did quite enjoy just the sheer amount of variety on the different knights on offer though. An absolutely bloodthirsty gore-soaked carnivore on the left here, and an all rather sinister and serene Acheron on the right. They also have a Brimstone Wardog deal as well for a little bit less than some other things. Again, good use of the lava there. Plus some cool scrap demon creations as well. The idea is to make some mechanised things to help stand in for demons allied to the knights. Besides commission painting services as well, he's also running the Castigator giveaway on his Instagram at the moment, basically giving away this rather spectacular knight, and to enter just literally follow his Instagram, links down in the video description, the draw to be done in 14 days. In any case, here's the price list which I'll leave on the screen there. Models can be sourced at discount, and if you'd like a quote, reach out to them on their email, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Let's move on to our next detachment of Sinister Knights though, and the next one is the Infernal Lance. This one's the all very demon-possessed one, making dark patch with the Chaos Deities to get some unnatural abilities, though often with the risk of a price. The core rule for this one is Malefic Surge, and it perhaps feels a little similar to the Chaos Space Marine rule. If you choose to activate it, then you make a leadership test in your command phase. If you fail the test, then you suffer D3 mortal wounds to your knight, but whether you pass or fail, you get to become empowered, and you place a token by the knight that remains that way until the next command phase, when it goes away unless you've expended it already before. In general, you'd want to expend that token by the time it gets back to your command phase, and you can choose to do so on these three different options. Either you can add plus 3 inches to your movement characteristic in the movement phase, add either lethal or sustained hits in either the shooting or the fight phase, or generate a 5+ invulnerable save and a 6+ feel no pain type save, and that can be either in the shooting phase or in the fight phase. Then the invulnerable is only going to matter in the fight phase as you've got one against ranged attacks already. Obviously it's going to be the choice between one of those, it's not going to be all of them active at once, but I feel like all of them are pretty meaningfully powerful things. The extra 3-inch threat range is really nice. Sometimes that might well be the difference between making a key charge or not doing so. Wardog Carnivores can be moving 17 inches and then still charging, which is really quite a long way. The lethal and sustained hits are both good. Lethal hits will be rather excellent on the Gatling Cannon Knight potentially. That's to make that into a really quite general purpose bruiser. Sustained hits could be good for a bunch of other knights though, with big heavy hitting knightly weapons that are going to be wounding on 3s or better. And then the invulnerable save and feel no pain type one is genuinely quite a good durability boost, and particular in melee. If that means that you get a save against some close combat attacks, and then also get a feel no pain on top of that, that could be a pretty meaningful reduction in damage that you take. It maybe feels like these are a bit more worth it for the big knights versus the smaller ones, just as you've got less chance of failing the leadership test, and also you lose a less significant portion of your health. Feels like for the war dogs you might just want to pick and choose when you're going to use them as opposed to all the time. I feel like for big Titanic ones it's just going to be basically use this pretty much most times. For stratagems for the Infernal household, I feel like a fair few of them with these and then the enhancements want to just add a bit more raw damage and defense. For 1 command point there's Profane Symbiosis, which allows you to make an additional Malefic Surge, so that means that after you've expended your token presumably it gets to check another leadership test, and if you do then you get another token. And you can only use this one once per battle round, so you can't use it to farm the detachment rule for loads of things. Definitely feels like that could be worth making use of though. Say for example you could have a melee knight that's just charged in and either used the extra movement to get there or the damage buff to hit harder. I guess it means that you could use both the movement and then go on to use the damage buff when it charges. Or you could use one of those and then basically have the durability one on hand for when the enemy no doubts tries to destroy it next turn. Definitely feels like that one could be a useful one. For 1 command point, there's Hellforged Construction. That one's a direct debuff in the enemy fight phase. You make enemy AP worse by 1 when attacking the model. Like Armour of Contempt equivalents, it means that that should only work against 1 unit now. But still, that could be easily powerful enough. Most good melee units tend to have AP2 or AP3, and that's going to mean that you take significantly less damage against them. I guess maybe it has a bit of overlap with the 5+ invulnerable save boost, though presuming that you might have used the boost for movement or damage, then that might not be an option anyway. For 1 command point, there's Corrupting Taint. You use this on a knight character that made a Malefic Surge in your command phase. One objective marker that they're in range of becomes a sticky objective, and that remains yours until the enemy controls it at the end of any phase. As with the options in the other detachments for this, it's generally really quite useful to have, particularly for big knights that might be able to plant a flag in an objective and then go on to deal some more damage to other enemy units. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Unleash Balefire. One enemy that was shot takes a battle shock test in your shooting phase. If they fail, then they're -2 to move and charge until the end of their next turn. I feel like this one being paired with a battle shock test is maybe a little bit unhelpful. Extra battle shocks certainly don't hurt given the army rule. I guess you could potentially set up a unit for extra +1 to wound attacks later on. The -2 to move and charge thing could be meaningful at keeping an enemy out of the fight, but at the same time, there's a good chance that you just spend 1 command point and then they pass the battle shock test and it wasn't really worth anything anyway. For 1 command point, there's Warp Vision. This allows you to ignore cover for a big Chaos Knight when shooting. Seems like this could be very nice for a Gatling Despoiler, particularly paired with the lethal hits from the detachment rule. That thing's just going to have a very high rate of fire and pretty effective against most stuff. Certainly feels like you could justify it there. Could be nice enough for the Tyrant as well, or covered in guns. Finally, for 1 command point, this one does have Diabolic Bulwark, a 4+ invulnerable save for their shooting phase. So basically when the enemy commits some serious firepower to a knight, you can make it significantly tougher. Really nice for warding off high power anti-tank weapons. Overall, as that goes, that feels like that's a pretty solid stratagem section. Certainly very nice to have Diabolic Bulwark. The extra Malefic Surge one certainly seems powerful. The worse in AP in the fight phase, again it's nice to have a defensive stratagem that works there really effectively. Sticky objectives are useful for knight armies, and the ignores cover when shooting could be good for the Despoiler Gatling cannons, which it looks like the detachment already encourages. You will be missing things like war dogs walking through walls, but overall that does feel like a solid stratagem section to me. Finally, for the Infernal Lance, we've got the Enhancements. The Knight Diabolus gives you +1 weapon skill, and your Knight also gains Lance when they're using the Sustained or Lethal Hits boost in melee. That's to give you a much harder hitting Knight on the charge. Could be really quite good for a Desecrator with a chainsaw maybe. The Rampager already hits on a 2+, so it's not going to get value out of the weapon skill, and you're probably going to be wounding most of your foes on 2s anyway, so weirdly enough just doesn't seem like it's going to be centered around the melee knights. I guess it would make the sort of mid-strength attacks of the Abhorrent significantly more scary as well. Definitely looks useful to me to turn a balanced knight into far more of a melee threat. Next, Blasphemous Engine gives you +2 wounds, and you can reroll leadership tests for Malefic Surge. I guess if you're doing those all game long, you're probably going to fail at least one of them, maybe 2. And maybe loosely equate that to getting around about 4 wounds worth of knight on the table. I guess that'll depend on the points cost. I feel like it's only really going to be worth it if it's cheap. Flesh Metal Fusion gives you +1 toughness, so you could have your Abhorrent Knight restored to a toughness 12, or the Tyrant to toughness 13, and then if you're using the defensive ability with the invulnerable save and the Feel No Pain boost, you gain +1 to save against damage 1 attacks. I feel like the boost to T12 or T13 is nice enough. Again, it certainly would depend on the points for that. As we'll talk about with Knight Toughness later, it helps you out against things like Strength 12, though not really all that much else. I feel like it's only going to be worth the difference if it's really quite a cheap one. The +1 save against damage 1 attacks just doesn't seem like it's going to be super important. I guess it could help you not take quite so much chip damage against certain units, but most of the things that actually threaten knights are going to be multi-damaged, and that bit of the rule only works if you're using the defensive buff anyway, which a lot of the time presumably you won't be. Finally, there's Bestial Aspect. This one gives you the assault keyword for ranged weapons, and if you're using boosted movement, you can ignore modifiers to that movement characteristic. So I guess with that, you could have a light Tyrant running around at 11-inch move with an extra d6 inches, so turn it from a very slow knight to a very fast knight that can run and gun. Again, it also seems to be pretty nice for, say, the Gatling Despoiler as well. Seems like that could get some angles on enemy units if you're going a big 13 inches plus d6 inches, though I guess you'd have the trade-off of not using lethal hits for that, unless you double down on the Malefic Surges with the Stratagem. Again, that one seems usable if it's cheap enough. Overall, I certainly guess that this detachment to get a lot of interest from people. Just getting flat extra damage on knights with sustained or lethal hits is really nice, and the mortal wounds that you can take from that isn't quite as painful as it used to be in 9th edition. It's quite cool that there's different ways that you could use the core rule as well, movement, defense or damage, and adapt to the situation and the enemy army. Plenty of the stratagems seem handy, in particular Diabolic Bulwark being an option is good. And then at first impressions, Knight Diabolus on a Reaper Chainsword Knight seems nice, though they're all at least usable depending on the points cost. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if this winds up being a more popular one. Movement can often win games in 40k, so being able to turn on an extra 3 inches and an advance could be really big. At least on paper, and easy lethal hits on the Gatling Knight seems excellent, and with access to Ignores cover, not really much is going to be able to ignore those. Next up, we've got the all very Titanic Knight focused one, and that's the Lords of Dread. Apparently the theming of this one is around big self-centered Titanic nobles seeking to carve out a name for themselves on the battlefield, and they've got no interest in fighting alongside supporting elements or war dogs, preferring to get the job done themselves. Compared with most 40k detachments, this one's a bit on the unusual side. A big part of the core rule is getting a free stratagem once per turn, and also compared with most attachments out there, it's got more enhancements. You've got 6 different enhancements in this one, 2 generic ones and then 4 deity related ones, so really quite a lot of ways in which you can customise your big stompy robots. The core rule is Tyrannical Court. This one gives Chaos Knight characters +2 OC, so that's 12 OC per big Titanic Knight. So a little bit more weight on objectives. The opponent's really going to struggle to contest that against you unless they've got quite a lot of battle line troops or something. Then to further help on the objective game, once per battle round, you can use this Claimed for the Dark God stratagem for free if the Warlord is on the battlefield. Claimed for the Dark Gods basically gives you a sticky objective, but compared with most sticky objective stratagems, it's far better than the majority. You can use it at the start of any phase, so you could move on to the objective marker and then trigger it at the start of the shooting phase, and you can't do that with the majority of those rules. You often have to control it in a command phase, and then as well as doing the usual thing, so that if your unit gets shot down, you'll still hold it unless the opponent is able to move off and take it off you, or say you could leave it behind and send your Titanic Knight after something else, and the objective would still be yours. On top of that, you also still count as having an objective control level of at least 5 at all times, so if the opponent has a unit of 5 or less trying to take it, they literally won't be able to take it even if there's no knights around. Obviously the whole detachment rule doesn't help you out in terms of damage or defense or leadership shenanigans and things, but between the extra boost to taking objectives and this really powerful rule to be able to claim them, it certainly seems to make fielding an army full of Titanic Knights a lot more tempting, and you still could have a small number of War Dogs there to help support the big boys to get some of the benefits of screening or expendable units. Going on to the stratagems, and obviously we've talked about one of them with that Claimed for the Dark Gods one. Certainly a really strong start to the section there, and if it made sense to, you could potentially use it as a paid version as well as the free version as well. You could sticky 2 objectives at once if it made sense. Moving on to the others though, and next up we have Spiteful Demise for 1 command point, and this one brings back a little of the auto-exploding goodness that previous Knight books have had. When rolling for Deadly Demise for a Chaos Knight character, it goes off on a 4+ rather than a 6. It'd still be so much more impactful if it was more reliable than that. It does maybe feel a little bit on the painful side throwing a command point at something that's only got a coin flip chance of going off. The sheer amount of mortal wounds that you could unleash from 6 inches from a big Titanic Knight could really take an absolutely enormous chunk out of the enemy army if it's going to die anyway. D6 on multiple different units from an Abhorrent class, more than that for a Cerastus or Tyrant, and I feel like if you're taking an army that's really full of the big guys, we are probably going to have at least some opportunity to use this. Situationally at least, it does feel quite good. For 2 command points, there's Runes of Disdain. This one's -1 damage for attacks made against a Chaos Knight character, and you can trigger it either in your opponent's shooting phase or the fight phase. For 2 command points, it is a pricey one, though it is really good against the right sort of damage output. Any damage 2 or damage 3 weapons are really not going to like this. It could mean a bunch of charging Sanguinary Guard aren't able to do anywhere near as much damage as they thought they would, and perhaps the Knight lives to strike back or something. Definitely could have some big potential. This attachment doesn't have Diabolic Bulwark though, so I guess if you want a reactive durability stratagem, it's usually going to be this one. Then for 1 command point, there's a vehicle busting one called Titanic Duel. 1 Chaos Knight character when shooting or fighting gets to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 this phase against 1 nominated enemy vehicle or monster. That's already at least a fairly good damage boost. In absence of other rules stacking on top of it, that's usually plus 36% in terms of damage, so it could easily be worth it on a big Titanic datasheet like the Knights. It gets even better if it's against enemy Titanic units though. You get to reroll all hits and all wound rolls, so it just means that this detachment is going to be spectacularly good at taking down their rivals, cutting down Imperial Knights or any other Titanic units that you might happen to be facing. It's really quite a solid stratagem though, and certainly good enough to be tempting if you're ever trying to take down a fairly tough monster or vehicle. For 1 command point, there's Trophy Hunter. A Knight character can consolidate 6 inches provided it winds up within engagement range. I guess that's one that you could think about either setting up or just taking a look at your Knight when it has the option to consolidate. It might depend on the opponent's army, what you can get in with, and whether you might actually give that unit some difficult decisions by tagging it in melee, maybe having to fall back and not shoot or charge, or at least maybe making them spend a stratagem to do so. It could also be a way to get to an objective marker as well, provided it did coincide with tagging the enemy unit. It still maybe feels like a bit more of a niche melee one. It's going to be fun sometimes, but doesn't really feel like quite so much as a necessity as some of them though. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Crush Like Vermin, and again this one's for a Knight character. You trigger it when you move over an enemy unit, you roll 6d6, and for each 4+ they take 1 mortal wound, and if any models are destroyed, then they test Battle Shock on top of that. You will be able to trigger this by basically moving up to the enemy unit and then moving back. That's the way that similar stratagems and bomber style rules have worked in 40k up to now. It could be a way to get a little bit more damage on an enemy unit, and occasionally out of sequence attacks can be really quite handy. It feels a bit on the niche side just due to having to get quite so close to the enemy though. A lot of the time you wouldn't have opportunity to do this, and you can't do it if you're making advanced moves or fallback moves. Overall, it feels like a stratagem section that's just a bit hit and miss. I feel like most of them have the potential to be useful, just really quite a lot of ones where they're only going to be handy in certain situations and not regardless of the opponent that you're fighting. I feel like the vehicle one seems fairly standout value if you're going to be fighting against those. Claim for the Dark God still seems like the really good one, though that's more part of the detachment rule than anything else. -1 damage and the high chance of auto-explode could both be worth it though. Then for the Lords of Dread, we've got the Enhancements, and as mentioned there's 6 of these rather than the usual 4. First up we've got Warpborn Stalker, and this allows the bearer to gain Deep Strike, and then on top of that you get to return to reserves once per game if you're not within engagement range at the end of the enemy turn. I guess in theory you could use this to rapid ingress something like a Rampager or a Lancer. I feel like this one and its equivalent for the Imperial Knights is maybe best on a shooting knight though. Basically turn 1 when it gets to the end of the enemy turn, you can see whether your knight's got some good shooting targets after it moves next turn. If it doesn't, then return it to reserves and deep strike somewhere else immediately after. Maybe getting some scary Tyrant weapon fire on an unlucky enemy vehicle and comboing with that stratagem perhaps, or melting some tough stuff at close range with a pair of thermal cannons on a despoiler. It certainly feels like a pretty powerful enhancement. Next up we've got Blessing of the Dark Master. This gives your knight stealth, so a -1 to hit at range. That might have a bit of overlap if you happen to choose that one as your first buff. But this one would also work within 18-inch range as well, and also gets the bonus of a once per game you can reduce damage to 0 after you've taken a saving throw. That second bit is definitely handy, as it basically guarantees that you negate 1 powerful damage attack. It'll be nice enough just against las cannon equivalents and the like, but extra good against really big things like Tau railguns or Imperial Guard Vanquisher tanks. When you get to use it against one of those, this will have immense value. I feel like it's really hard to go too far wrong with good durability buffs for Chaos and Imperial Knights. It tends to be what they need when they're moving up the board and then getting focus fire by a bunch of other stuff. Then the other 4 of these all are vaguely themed to the Chaos Gods, and reminiscent of some of the ones from 9th edition. Just like the first 2, they have a passive buffing effect and a once per game ability. First up we've got the Throne Mechanicum of Skulls. This one's the corn one and allows you to reroll charge rolls and gives you a once per game advance and charge. For a dedicated melee knight like a Rampager or a Lancer, that one is a very nice one. Basically means that you'd have an average charge threat range of around about 24 inches for a Rampager, going up to about 26 inches for a Lancer, and both of those seem rather excellent, very easy to underestimate how far they can go, and kind of impractical to keep out of range of if the opponent wants to move units up the board. Next up we've got a Slaanesh themed one in the Blade of Celerity. This one gives your knight the assault keyword and once per game fights first. Both of those are pretty good, though don't necessarily help each other. I guess maybe could be nice enough for a mixed role knight. Depending on the eventual price of this one, just the fights first alone could be well worth it on a melee knight. The assault keyword definitely doesn't hurt on a ranged one though. Again, you could have something like a Knight Tyrant moving around unusually quickly. Probably feels like it's going to be most useful overall on a mixed role knight, maybe like the Desecrator. Nurgle gets the Putrid Carapace. This one gives you a 2+ save, and once per game in either player's command phase you can regenerate d6 lost wounds. The 2+ save is definitely a pretty excellent durability increase. I guess this one would compete against the Blessing of the Dark Master. I feel like I'd probably value the 2+ save over the stealth, though perhaps the canceller damage over the regenerate d6 wounds. It'll also depend on eventual points cost. And then finally the Tzeentch themed one is the Mirror of Fates. Once per battle round you can use the command point reroll stratagem for free for the knight, and even if it's been used elsewhere that phase. And then it's got one of the once per battle increase the cost of a stratagem special rules that as per the balanced state slate that's to be swapped out for the aura of +1 command points within 12 inches. Though again that's a very good debuff on a scary Titanic Knight moving up into the midboard. You might be able to affect really quite a big area of the table with that, particularly as units move in to try and take it down. It seems like a fairly solid general purpose combo and could be nice enough with a knight with a huge gun potentially, perhaps the Desecrator or Tyrant to reroll a key wound roll or something. Just using command point rerolls for charges or melee attacks could well be worth it though on more dedicated melee ones. Overall certainly looks like an interesting detachment. I feel like outside of the sticky objectives one, the stratagems just don't feel quite as standout compared with some. I guess the rerolls one is quite nice if you're fighting vehicles, and -1 damage is big but also costs big. The enhancements do feel really fun though. Basically all of them look usable, and between the two abilities they feel like there's different ways that you could use them as well. It just feels like pretty good fun to say maybe have 4 big fallen nobles with their own custom attributes, and maybe a war dog or 2 to back them up to do some grunt work and throw them into the enemy army. Lastly, for the detachments, we've got the Houndpack Lance, and this one's the War Dog spam detachment. The detachment theme's a big pack of War Dogs turned out to assail and kill a key target. That sort of theme has certainly been the order of the day for strong Chaos Knight lists for a silly amount of time now. I don't think anyone's against the idea of that list still existing, but it's just been kind of weird that that's been the best way to play Chaos Knights with no Titanic models, at least for the vast majority of the time that they've existed. If you're going to do that without any Titanics though, then this is the only place that you can do so, as it's the only one that allows a War Dog to be the Warlord. As the Stalker doesn't get character keywords innately anymore, this is the only place that you can get one. As part of army construction, you must include at least 3 War Dogs, and those War Dogs gain the character keyword, so they can be chosen as Warlord and take enhancements. In the detachment as well, the War Dog units gain battle line, so you can take up to 6 of each, whereas they've lost that for the rest of the army, so you're only going to be limited to 3 of each War Dog datasheet elsewhere. The core rule of the detachment is called Mark's Prey. This one's almost sort of like an Oath of Moment equivalent. You choose an enemy unit in the command phase, attacks made by War Dogs that can see it get sustained hits 1 against that target. Sustained hits 1 is quite a nice boost. It basically means plus 25% damage unless there's anything else going on. It seems like this didn't want you to make the Havoc Pod deletion laser any stronger, so that's why it won't affect things out of line of sight. But overall it maybe feels like it's going to be most useful for shooting War Dog things or focusing fire against one big target. A bunch of Brigands and Executioners is going to be a lot more vicious with this on the go. One thing that feels a bit stupid though is that the War Dog Carnivore already has sustained hits 1, and it just seems like a very odd choice they've decided that that one specifically won't be able to benefit from this detachment rule. Beyond that though, it certainly looks like it adds a fair bit of value in raw damage. Moving on into stratagems, and for 2 command points we've got Voxhowl. At the start of the shooting or fight phase, a War Dog character makes enemies within 6 inches take battle shock, and friendly War Dogs that are battle shocked nearby have the chance to test to cancel that. I feel like this one is probably one that could have been 1 command point rather than 2 for some reason. I guess theoretically you could do things like make your War Dogs +1 to wound against the enemy, but that's still going to be very unreliable given that they might just pass that battle shock test. I'm just really not too sure why this one's 2 command points rather than 1. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Hungry for Combat. For this one you need 2 War Dogs in melee with the same enemy unit. They can only attack that one enemy unit, but they get critical hits on a 5+ when they do so. As mentioned, the Carnivores get sustained hits at base, so this one seems like it's maybe the good one for them. You could have 2 of them with really quite a serious amount of damage going on, with lots of sustained hits popping off on a 5 and 6. For other ones you need the detachment rule to be in effect to even think about benefiting from this, and it just feels a bit clunky to set up as well. You need to have 2 War Dogs charging side by side, none of them are blocking off each other from making the charge, and both of them actually having made the charge successfully, and then actually be going into an enemy unit that is actually going to justify the extra damage output. And it just seems that between all that, there's quite a lot of ifs before this stratagem becomes worth it to me. Maybe more reliably useful, if not crazily exciting, is Cunning Hunter. This one gives you 4-back shoot and charge for a War Dog. Generally it's good to be able to access that for vehicle heavy armies, War Dogs no exception. Means that if you've been tagged by enemy units you can 4-back, still shoot them and have all of your other War Dogs fire into the same target as well. It could make the decision to 4-back just a little bit less tricky. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Animalistic Rage. This one I think is quite a nice one, and a War Dog that was just destroyed can shoot or fight on death, and when it does so it targets the enemy units that destroyed it. If you're fighting it sounds like you do the entire process of the fight steps, so pile in, fight, and then you can consolidate. Only after that do you roll for deadly demise and things. For 1 command point that seems like a pretty good use of extra damage. Should be plenty of chances to use it with quite so many War Dogs running around, and might cause some serious problems for the opponent as they destroy stuff. This one seems like it will be absolutely murderous if you have War Dog Carnivores being wiped out by enemies in melee. If you're fighting against a melee army, you could have a Carnivore run in, kill a unit, and then get charged by something else and then fight on death there to do a whole bunch more damage to that unit too. I feel like the options for things like Brigands or Executioners shooting could occasionally be worth it, but just doesn't really seem quite so standout as that. For 1 command point there's Harrying Hounds, and this one gives you a reactive move for a War Dog. You get to move it 6 inches, activated when the enemy finishes a move within 9 inches in their movement phase. Again, that one seems like a very good stratagem as well. Always very disruptive when you approach an enemy unit and then that unit promptly hides behind terrain or backs away from a charge. It feels like there could be plenty of times when that could basically save a War Dog's life for 1 command point. We might be able to do other interesting things like get in the right place for objectives or even set up heroic interventions if you got more CP. That one definitely feels like one of the stronger ones. Finally, for 1 command point there's Encircling Pack. This one allows you to return a War Dog within 12 inches of a board edge into strategic reserve, provided that War Dog isn't in engagement range. As per normal with those style ones, it triggers at the end of the opponent's fight phase, so your model could vanish off the board and then turn up in your next reinforcement phase quite soon. Again, that's another really useful support one, pretty much good wherever it turns up in Warhammer 40k. Always nice to be able to press the attack a bit more and then maybe throw a War Dog into the enemy backfield to try and assail their home objective potentially. You might need to think about it a bit for setup though, and make sure that they're close enough to the edge to be able to trigger it if they're left alive. Overall for the Stratagems, I feel like there's some much stronger and weaker ones here. Basically I'd say that it feels like the 3 on this page are really quite nice. Animalistic Rage, great for fights on death carnivores. Harrying Hounds for reactive moves, and Return to Reserves is good. The fallback shoot and charge one is nice enough too, I guess. Then finally we've got the enhancements for the Houndpack lands. I was wondering if there might be some themed as a sort of Taskmaster Knights leading a pack of War Dogs, but apparently not. All of these ones can only be taken by those 3 nominated character War Dogs. First up, we've got the Prey Slayer's Mantle. This one, weirdly enough, gives your War Dog model the super heavy walker keyword, basically allowing you to smash through big bits of terrain. Could be nice enough to hide behind a ruin and then strike out, not having to worry about going around. That one seems like a carnivore would be the one that most enjoys that. Final Howl is an interesting enough buffing one. While the War Dog model is within 6 inches of the bearer, each time it makes an attack, re-roll a wound roll of 1. That applies both at range and in melee. It's not the biggest damage boost in the world, but at the same time that could apply to quite a lot of War Dog shooting if you wanted. It could be affecting multiple Brigands or Executioners at the same time, and it would still affect the bearer as well. Could make their melee a bit punchier. At the right points cost, that seems like a pretty solid one. Next up, we've got Loping Predator. This gives your War Dog assault for their ranged weapons. Would have to be quite a cheap one given that it's affecting a model that isn't exactly the biggest one in the world. Looks like a Brigand would be the ideal target of that, particularly with the Demon Breath Spears having a closer range than they did previously. Finally, the Panoply of the Cursed Knights makes a reappearance here. This was from the Index detachment, and it basically gives you a sort of always-on Armour of Contempt, worsening AP by 1 when attacking this model, though no longer able to be taken by a Titanic model anymore, so the effect isn't quite as big on War Dogs obviously. It still gives you one that's significantly tankier. Often that's going to be kind of equivalent to the War Dog in question having a 2+ save. Again, if it's at least a reasonably cheap cost, that could be tempting. Overall, at first glance, it does seem like it offers some pretty adequate support to War Dogs. The core rule is useful enough for focusing fire. Plenty of the stratagems are really quite handy for most 40k armies. Reactive moves, automatic fight on death for 1 command point, and return to reserves are nice. And the enhancements all seem usable enough, though probably aren't going to be crazy game-changing when they're applied to just one War Dog. I guess the biggest question is whether or not War Dog datasheets are still going to be capable of carrying the entire army. They definitely have had some downgrades in this book, going down to Toughness 9 and only OC 6, so there'll be a lot more weapons that are effective against them, and they're not going to have quite the same sort of weight on objectives as they once did. I think it would still be nice enough if this one was viable, though hopefully when points costs are revealed and everything, and people have had chance to playtest with it, it would be quite cool to see one of the other detachments actually take the lead with some Titanic Chaos Knights at its core. Overall, between each of those, I feel like the detachments do have enough to make them genuinely interesting. Traitoris Lance does actually mean that you get to play with the faction mechanic significantly more than the others. The supporting options are pretty good as well. The Veil of Medrengard is nice, as are Walkthrough Walls War Dogs. Infernal just seems all around mighty. Extra speed and damage where it's needed, plus some pretty good stratagems. It is the one that gets Diabolic Bulwark, which I think is going to be a big deal. Feels like shooty despoilers with dual Gatling cannons would enjoy the lethal hits here as well. The Lords of Dread do get some fairly powerful objective rules. That stratagem is one of the best sticky objective ones in the game. Beyond that though, I feel like it's maybe the enhancements that are the most standout thing. I think with the stratagems though, I'd be kind of surprised if that one winds up being the strongest of the detachments, unless the big knights have just significantly better points cost for what they do versus the War Dogs. Finally, we've got the Houndpack Lance, a good detachment rule, reactive moves, return to reserves, and fight on death. It does look pretty solid. It's just going to be dependent on whether or not the War Dog datasheets are powerful enough to carry the army still. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the detachments, which ones would draw you to them the most. I feel like for me the one I'd be most excited about at first impressions is the Infernal one. Extra movement and damage and Diabolic Bulwark just all seem very easy to use from a raw might point of view, even if it does lack a few of the subtle things of the other stuff that's on offer. Moving on though, and beyond the Chaos Knight detachments, we've got the datasheets. This one I think is the single codex in Warhammer 40k with the fewest datasheets. 5 Abhorrent Knight chassis in the Desecrator, Despoiler, Abhorrent, Ruinator and Rampager, the Knight Tyrant with its big guns, and then the War Dogs with the Carnivore, Brigand, Stalker, Huntsman and Executioner. You'd still be able to use the Imperial Armor Knights as well, so the Thrastus patterns with their big fast movement and boosted wounds, the Acastus ones with their big points cost and massive firepower, the two Questor variants, and then the Wardog Moirax. Out of those, some of the Thrastus ones have been fairly solid. The Lancer and the Atropos have been the main ones that people have tended to gravitate to in 10th edition out of Forge World stuff. As mentioned, you can put in allied demons as well, a few Nurglings, maybe some Plague Bearers, and a beast or two. They feel like some of the easiest ways to have some small unit disruption in a Chaos Knight list. It's really nice to have some units to do some absolute grunt work or far more sacrificial screening than a Wardog could be. For the points cost for the Knights, bear in mind that the printed points aren't final for these. I feel like when people make first reactions to 10th edition codexes, they often tend to take the printed cost at face value, but they always tend to be incorrect to a greater or lesser degree. In 2025 we've had the guard book where combat engineers were printed at 35 points and the actual cost turned out to be 70, so literally double the amount of what they are printed. Games Workshop will likely issue the new digital points sometime in the next couple of weeks. I'll aim to cover them on the channel when they come out. Sometimes they also give them to content creators as well to talk through them, and I'll certainly aim to cover them here when they drop. First up, before jumping into the datasheets themselves, it's maybe worth talking through the broad themes and the big changes that they've had. Knight armies are always going to be ones of big stompy robots. The smallest things are the Wardogs that move fast but are still fairly tough vehicle profiles with some big hitting damage, going up to the massive Titanic ones that tower above them. They have good toughness, high wound characteristics, and an invulnerable save against range but not melee with their ion shields. They can be intimidating for armies to play against that haven't brought enough anti-tank in particular, though perhaps at least somewhat often at big top tournament levels they might tend to have a bit of a skill ceiling. With individual big models there's just far less room for subtle tricks and being able to outmaneuver the opponents. It seems that in the update for the Codex though, the Knight datasheets have got some pretty big changes, and in general the changes just really haven't been well received. Overall they probably will make the individual Wardogs and Big Knights weaker on an individual level, though obviously as ever with Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop can always adjust points costs. Just about any datasheet in the game can be good or bad depending on how cheap they are, though at the same time it's maybe not the best feeling to know that the army needs to get a bit cheaper to remain the same amount of good. It's not exactly the best feeling in the world. For the main overarching changes, there's ones to Wardogs and then Knight toughness characteristics. First up, Wardogs in the Codex aren't battle line anymore, and their OC drops down to 6 from 8. On top of that, they don't have any innate character Wardogs. Previously the Stalker Wardog had the character keyword, but now it no longer does so. As well as the OC debuff dropping down to 6 as well, they also have their objective control degrade at lower wound characteristics. So when you've got 5 wounds or fewer, you're not just -1 to hit anymore, but you're also half objective control, so you're only going to have 3. Between all that, that's going to be some big changes for Wardogs both at an army construction and just a gameplay level. From army construction, that means that you basically always need a Titanic character outside of the Houndpack lance, as otherwise you won't have a character to be your warlord. And then again, outside of that detachment, you're only going to be able to take 3 of any Wardog variant, so you can't say, just for example, spam 6 Wardog Carnivores and Wardog Brigands in the Traitoris lance. They just have to go in the Houndpack lance now. I feel like the OC degrading will make them easier to overcome when skirmishing for objectives. They'll still be able to beat a squad of say 5 regular guys with OC 1, but both dropping down to 6 will mean that enemies are able to contest them a little bit easier, and dropping down to 3 when they're damaged is also going to mean that they're not going to have quite so much weight when they're on their last legs. It definitely could be somewhat of a weakness for Wardog spam armies, but I guess in terms of points per objective control on the board, they are still going to be far more efficient than the Big Knights, as you might be able to afford say 3 Wardogs per Big Knight or similar. The other really major change to the Codex are the toughness characteristics, which again really isn't a particularly good feels-good change for Knights players. Now in the new book, Wardogs are toughness 9 with 14 wounds. They used to be toughness 10 with 12 wounds. Abhorrent class Knights are toughness 11 with 26 wounds, where they used to be toughness 12 with 22, basically gaining 4 wounds but losing a pip of toughness. And the Tyrant has dropped down to toughness 12 from toughness 13, though it's got 28 wounds rather than 24. That one had the additional nerf of dropping down to a 3+ save from a 2+ though, and that was quite a big blow to that one. For the impressions of the overall maths of that one, to me it feels like the Abhorrent chassis Knights have basically been side graded. They're going to be tougher against some targets, though weaker against strength 12. For the Wardogs, I'd probably say it's overall a downgrade, even with the extra 2 wounds per chassis, and for the Tyrant it definitely feels like a downgrade. I feel like the drop from a 2+ save to a 3+ save tips the balance there. I feel like for whatever reason people don't seem to be amazing at doing the maths in their head as to -1 toughness versus say +4 wounds for the standard Abhorrent or I guess Questoris Knight. It means that against the vast majority of guns they're basically +18% tougher, which is quite a big increase there. It's only against specific things, though in particular the common las cannon style profile with strength 12, that they are going to be a bit less durable. They're around about 90% as tough as they were there. But the extra wounds definitely help. The extra 4 wounds that you have to chew through there really help to cushion the blow. A little bit easier to take out with the enemy's dedicated anti-tank weapons, though against the majority of things, including really big anti-tank weapons with strength 14 and higher, they're going to be outright tougher. For the War Dogs and Tyrants though, as mentioned, it just doesn't seem quite as good. War Dogs dropping to toughness 9 is a bit more impactful in my opinion. Strength 9 Melter and fairly common strength 10 things are going to be wounding them better, as are strength 5 as well. I'd say that's probably enough to outweigh the extra 2 wounds, but again they will be tougher against plenty of things, including say against standard las cannons for them. Strength 12 will just be wounding them exactly the same, and they'll have more wounds to take down. The one that feels like it's lost out the most is the Tyrant, in particular the save 2+ to save 3+, I feel that really tips the balance there, and that one just is going to be easier to kill than it was before. But all these calculations are kind of meaningless if the points change significantly. If say the Tyrant drops down a fair bit to account for the lesser defensive stats, then it could actually even wind up being tougher per point than before. I feel like the motivation for this one was probably done to try and make knights interact more with other units out there, so that a few more strength characteristics are just a bit better at actually meaningfully hurting knights, which I think isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, and it can still make them very tough against plenty of things due to the high wound count. It might be a bitter pill to swallow for some players in the short term, though I feel like it's probably not the worst gameplay decision on the whole, provided it's balanced well with points, though I guess we'll see how well they do on that front. They certainly haven't managed very well with War Dog spam ruling the roost for Chaos Knights for far too long. The toughness changes and everything put to one side though, let's talk through the datasheets. Let's start with the new one before going through the War Dogs, then the Abhorrents, then the Tyrant, in that sort of order. The Knight Ruinator is the new upgrade sprue that was added to the existing Chaos Knight kit. This one gives it a massive flamer, some Terrapulse missiles, and a siege drill called a Fellbore. The lore is that it operates as a close-range brawler, taking down one target before moving on to the next. The price is reportedly $200 US. It has unfortunately meant that Games Workshop have upped the price for the inclusion of the extra sprue. Not really any big surprise there though. The model's nice enough, though it is basically just the exact same Chaos Knight miniature, it just gets equipped with different weapons. Going through its datasheet and it gets the Abhorrent Knight stat line, moving 10 inches with 26 wounds at toughness 11 with a 3+ save and the 5+ invulnerable and the big OC 10. As mentioned, that's significantly tougher against most things, just not against las cannons or strength 6. For ranged weapons it gets a Dark Flame Lance, 2d6 torrent hits at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2, so sort of like a mini version of the Tyrant's Dark Flame Conflagration Cannon type thing, and then it gets the Terrapulse missiles, 2d6 shots hitting on a 3+ at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2. So that's a lot of strength 8 damage 2 there. It's going to be very good at taking down things like standard issue Space Marines and will be pretty nice against things like heavy infantry and Terminators. Here's the rough amount of kills that you might expect against a standard squad. Basically fairly good against everything that's medium or lighter infantry, not quite so hot against vehicles where it's wounding on a 5. It's not quite as scary as you'd probably hope for against enemy tanks and vehicles that might be able to gain a bit more damage from its special rule. Then for its melee attack it gets its Fellbore. This one's kind of similar to the Reaper Chainsaw profile but gets slightly less AP on its strike profile and then fewer attacks and worse AP on its sweep. In exchange for that though it gets anti-vehicle and anti-monster 2+, so kind of expected for a great big siege drill. It's going to be really quite an efficient one, particularly against big tough enemy vehicles, things that are toughness 11 and toughness 12 or even higher. They're going to be the things that this outperforms against compared with most knights out there. I feel like the anti-keywords don't maybe add quite as much as you might hope for though, particularly compared with the Reaper Chainsword that's going to be wounding most things on a 3 anyway, or the Warp Strike Claw where you're going to be getting lots of attacks at damage 8. Both of those could be similar or even better against tough targets. It doesn't really feel like it's crazily outperforming the standard. Then we've got its special rules. Its first one is Methodical Destruction. This one, as expected, was nominating a quarry in the enemy army. At the start of the first battle round, you get to select a unit from the opponent's army. This model gets to reroll or wound rolls against that target, and if that target gets destroyed, it gets to select another victim to go at next. That is quite a good damage buff. Feels more relevant for its shooting, maybe more than its melee, particularly if it's wounding on a 2+. Could be enough to make the big flamer and the missiles punch up against tough stuff. Otherwise, its War Dog buff is called Close Range Killers. Wardogs within 9 inches get extra AP when they target the closest eligible enemy unit. That applies to range and melee. That's pretty much the old Brigand rule. Could be quite nice for Avenger chain cannons, or maybe the Wardog Executioner that would really like that on the AP-1 autocannons it has. Feels like it could be at least fairly easy to get that to trigger. That is quite a big aura for the Wardogs to be near. Probably going to help if they're advancing alongside it though. Overall, I'm maybe a little bit pessimistic about this one unless it gets an incredibly cheap points cost. Having range damage that primarily targets infantry just isn't quite as general purpose compared with some. I feel like if the melee damage is to make compromises and really go after vehicles, it probably should have been better against those targets. It just really isn't all that different against a whole bunch of targets versus either the Reaper Chainsword or the Warp Strike Claw. Let's go through the other datasheets though and start off with the Wardogs and then go through to the bigger knights. First up, we've got previously the cheapest Wardog in the Wardog Executioner. This one's the sort of Lawless Helverin pattern. And as with the other Wardogs now, they move 12 inches, have 14 wounds at toughness 9 with a 3+ save and they're 5+ invulnerable against range. The Wardogs only get leadership 7 and they have OC 6 which degrades to 3 after they're down to 5 wounds or fewer. The Executioner gets 2 sets of autocannons, both firing at strength 9, AP-1 and damage 3 with 4 attacks apiece. So basically fairly general purpose things where they're going to stack some saves against most units, but they've got low AP so not many will get through. Though damage 3 does mean that they hurt when the opponent does roll a 1 or 2 or something. As it's made from the Imperial Knight Armiger kit, you get either the choice of a melter gun or a heavy stubber on the top. The special rule for the Executioner has generally not been a great one. You get a +1 to hit against units below half strength. It will happen from time to time, though not particularly reliably, and I feel like the damage boost isn't quite strong enough that you're actually going to want to adjust target priority most of the time. It's still going to make sense to shoot the most important thing or the thing that the profile's most effective against. The special rule did get a small boost. If it is able to successfully execute something, then before the last model is removed, then enemy units within 3 inches have to take a battle shock test. I guess that could be handy enough to double down on things, maybe with a +1 to wound from the detachment rule. I feel like it's alright, but it's going to be quite an unreliable rule to make any advantage of. I feel like the autocannons aren't generally going to be reliably killing things unless you're getting lucky, and even then, if they do make battle shock tests happen, the opponent might not fail them. Previously, this one struggled to compete before, and basically the Brigand was always taken in its place. Perhaps the biggest issue for this one is the AP. There isn't an easy stratagem to get you to AB2 unlike the Imperial Knights, and they don't get the big inbuilt rerolls that Index Imperial Knights has. I guess in theory it could pair well with the Ruinator. If it winds up being strong enough to run in its own right, it would enjoy the extra AP that could bring. I still hope that this one will probably be one of the cheapest Wardogs if it's going to compete with the rest. Next up, the Wardog Brigand, and the ever-faithful gun turret Wardog has taken some fairly big nerfs. Previously it had a points cost of 165 points, so was the most expensive one that you can field, though I guess that might well not be the case anymore. First up, it previously hit on a 2+, now it hits on a 3. To be honest, I feel like that's not anything people would have been surprised at if it had come out hitting on a 3. I was kind of surprised that it got a 2+ ballistic skill to start with, really. It does make it less threatening compared with what it was, though. For another solid nerf to its shooting, it also lost range on the Demon Breath Spear, so that basically means you have a 24-inch range Avenger chain cannon, 12 shots at strength 6, AP1 and damage 1, that clears out infantry quite well, and then the Demon Breath Spear is still really punchy, 2 shots at strength 12, AP4, damage D6, and an enormous melter 4 if you can get within 9-inch range. It's still a very scary gun indeed, but that extra 6-inch of range that is lost will limit its targets more than before. Otherwise, it gets the choice of a stubber versus an indirect firing Havoc multi-launcher. In general, people have generally tended to take the Havocs before. They can add up to a fairly meaningful amount of anti-infantry when they're taken en masse. And finally, for perhaps one further nerf, this thing's got ranged weapons ignore cover when targeting enemies on objectives, as opposed to the extra AP that it had against the closest targets. I feel like I'd probably rate that rules change as a slight downgrade once again. It's definitely still useful, but getting that Avenger chain cannon to a reliable AP2 against close range infantry, that was quite good. Overall, just seems that they've hit the datasheet in all sorts of different ways. I feel like the overall Wardog changes of toughness and OC aren't good news either, and it's lost a lot of firepower, made it close range and with a worse special rule. As a result, I'd certainly hope that it drops significantly in points from 165, probably going down to somewhere closer to the Executioner. Next up, we've got the Wardog Huntsman, and this one's the sort of Armiger Warglaive equivalent, again built from the Loyalist kit. This one gets another Demon Breath Spear, again with the shorter range, and then you've got a Melter Gun versus a Stubber on top, and it strikes with a Reaper Chain Talon. Maybe not standout combat, but quite general purpose, either 4 attacks at strength 10, AP3, damage 3, or 8 attacks at strength 8, AP2, damage 1. Aside from the general Wardog and Demon Breath Spear changes, the biggest change for the Huntsman is its special rule. Previously it had reroll 1s to wound and damage against monsters and vehicles, and now it's just been changed to a fairly general purpose reroll wound rolls against them. I feel like that's pretty solidly scary both for its Meltagun, its Demon Breath Spear, particularly against tough stuff, and it'll also help out with the Chain Talon in melee as well. I guess if you know that you'll be fighting a lot of monsters and vehicles, this one will be tempting. Previously it tended to get a bit overshadowed by the Wardog Stalker with its more flexible gear, and points depending it still looks like it's going to be a debate between the two there. Speaking of which, the Wardog Stalker can be equipped with a fairly similar profile. You could take a Reaper Chain Talon and the Demon Breath Spear. They can swap out the ranged weapon for the Chain Cannon and the melee weapon for the Slaughter Claw if you'd like. That one gets 4 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2. The Wardog Stalker is no longer a character as mentioned earlier, so you can't take enhancements on it outside of the Houndpack Lance. It still has an interesting special rule though, as it's gained Scout. So now it means that it's the only thing that's in the Chaos Knight Codex that's going to be able to get into the mid-board before turn 1. That does seem like really quite a nice selling point in itself. You could combo with some forward deploying Nurglings to make sure that you've got enough room to scout into, so the opponent doesn't pen you back. It does mean that it should have a very easy time getting to the mid-board objective straight away. Otherwise looks like it kept the same special rule. It gets a buff against isolated enemy units. If there's no other enemy units in the army within 6 inches of its target, then you get +1 to the wound roll. That's going to be situational depending on whether the opponents move things out on their own and what things it's going into. When it triggers though, it's definitely a solid damage buff. Still feels like there's at least fairly good odds that this one's going to be an interesting one between the flexible loadout and scouts. Finally for the Wardogs, we've got the Wardog Carnivore. Pre-Codex these were 140 points, really quite cheap, brutal and effective for the cost. And in terms of raw damage for the stats, if you don't have any buffs or army synergy on the go, these usually tend to rank amongst the most efficient damage dealers against most targets in all of 40k. To get that scary melee damage to the enemy, they move fast as well, a big 14-inch move, and while they've been cheap, they're pretty excellent outriders for the army. When they hit home, their melee profile has been changed a bit, but not super meaningfully. They previously hit on a 2+, but now they hit on a 3, but that's been cancelled out as they've gained sustained hits based on their melee profiles, so the numbers might be a little bit more swingy depending on how many 6s that you roll, but overall with average throws turn on turn, they should get the same amount of damage. Otherwise for their melee profile, they'll have them slightly consolidated. They decided to remove the strike version of the Reaper Chain Talon that it's armed with, which I guess was kind of redundant as you'd always either want to use the Slaughter Claw if you were going for that one, as it was just directly better. Either way though, they are really quite murderous. They get an average of 5 hits at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2, which is going to be kind of ruinous to a bunch of enemy vehicles out there, or an average of 10 hits at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1 to clear through hordes. For its special rule, you can still reroll charge rolls. It also gains reroll advanced rolls as well, so it means it's going to have yet more speed when it's jumping from cover to cover in the early game before it can be making charges. Overall, provided it keeps a fairly similar points cost, I'd still say that this one's looking like one of the scariest units in the book. Its damage output is pretty much still equally good, and it looks like it'll be great users of certain stratagems like the Walk Through Walls one for Traitoris Lance, or potentially Fight on Death in the Houndpack Lance, and Infernal could be interesting enough for their threat range as well. Getting extra 3-inch movement means you could be moving 17 inches and still charging with up to 3 of these if you wanted, and again that sounds all very intimidating indeed. Moving on, let's talk about the other Titanic class knights though, and let's go through the Abhorrent ones. Like the Ruinator, they move 10 inches, have 26 wounds at toughness 11 now with their 5+ invulnerable at range, and they get the towering keyword, which means that if they nose in terrain they can kind of see over it provided they've got direct line of sight, unlike other vehicles in 40k. I feel like pre-Codex most of these were playable enough at their points costs, but as ever the Chaos Knights have been overshadowed by the Wardogs. The Knight Desecrator pre-Codex was 400 points, this is the one that gets the great big laser destructor, 3 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 3, massive anti-tank firepower there, and looks like this one still retains unusually good accuracy, hitting on a 2+. If it takes aim at monsters and vehicles it gets devastating wounds as well, so a small chance to punch some big damage straight through invulnerable saves. In melee he can either get the Reaper Chainsword or the Warp Strike Claw, so solid general purpose there. I'll probably be more tempted by the Claw out of the two myself. This Wardog buff is a pretty easy one to use as well. Reroll hit rolls of 1 at range for Wardogs within 9 inches, certainly not too hard to make good use of that, either with some pushing up the board or with Brigands or Executioners trailing in its wake. Aside from the standard Titanic Knight changes, this one hasn't really been altered all that much at all, and to me it still feels like easily one of the ones that's got some good potential to get good very easily. Having a massive anti-tank gun really doesn't hurt to add big value in 40k. and does feel like a solid option for a mixed role knight. If say you've got certain enhancements or some buffs that favour it, it would quite like that +1 weapon skill 1 with the lance keyword on its melee maybe. Next up we've got the dedicated melee Evil Knight Gallant, and that's the Knight Rampager. Pre-Codex this was 380 points, gets a similar sort of Abhorrent Knight stat line, but it gets a boosted movement of going 12 inches rather than 10. It doesn't get any significant amount of range damage, but its melee damage is pretty brutal, either 6 attacks with a Warp Strike Claw at strength 20, AP 3 and damage 8, or doing 2 different flavours of sweep profile, either at damage 2 or damage 3, depending on what you happen to be in close combat with. It looks like all of those melee profiles still hit on a 2+, and what's more they also gain sustained hits all the time as well. Previously you'd get that when you were on the charge, now you get devastating wounds on the charge, and sustained hits is just something that it has literally all the time. Overall that means that in terms of raw damage, it's got a little bit better there, both of its charging or being charged. Unfortunately though, it's not going to be quite as reliable at getting to close combat at long range. It's no longer able to advance and charge once per game, and that is a shame as it was a really reliable way to get it to combat all the way up the board very quickly. Its other special rule is to boost nearby Wardog melee. You get reroll 1s to hit for melee Wardogs within 9 inches of it. It still feels like an interesting unit, though again I still hope that he'd be on the lower end of the knightly points cost. Feels like he could make great use of the Veil of Medringard in the Traitoris lands, or maybe the +3 inch movement in Infernal. Again, pretty intimidating to think that you could just have this guy moving 15 inches before charging, and there is that enhancement in the Titanic Nice Focus detachment for advance and charge as well. Again, that could be tempting for the Rampager. Next up we've got the Knight Despoiler, and this one's the flexible Questoris version, basically able to take all the kits that the Imperials can get, or at least all the bits, not including the Knight Preceptor and the new Defender variant. It seems that newer knightly tech is still locked to the Imperials. It looks like pretty well all this war gear didn't change. There's the Reaper Chainsword and the Warp Strike Claw as before, and then the 3 different versions of ranged weapons. The Rapid Fire Battle Cannon with a massive amount of spammed shots, all at strength 10, AP 1, damage 3. The Thermal Cannon, which is 24 inch range, a big strength 12, AP 4 and damage D6, though most scarily it's got a Melter 6, so absolutely ludicrous damage within 12 inches. And then perhaps the one that this knight often tends to get associated with the Despoiler Gatling Cannon. You can potentially still dual wield them as well, so that's to be 36 shots at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2, and all that to a good range as well. Good to see that it didn't lose any flexibility with war gear options, and it can still also take a top-mounted weapon as well, often that Ruin Spear rocket pod for 3 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage D6. It seems that on its attack profile, the only thing that got a small change was that its Titanic feet hit on a 4+ rather than a 3. It's still not exactly going to be doing loads of trampling damage either way there though. Its self-buffing datasheet rule allows you to reroll 1 dice whenever it shoots or fights, and then otherwise its Dread Dominion special rule got slightly improved for nearby Wardogs. This one now functions by giving them +1 to their leadership as opposed to +1 to battle shock test, which is a little bit better, and they also get an extra pip of OC as well, which maybe doesn't hurt but is often unlikely to tip any balances. The options for double ranged weapons certainly seem interesting. As mentioned, are certainly drawn to lethal hits on the dual battle cannons in a detachment that can ignore cover for a command point as well. It just feels like with that thing on the go, you could have these things be very monstrously general purpose, and you could take multiple. I feel like the other big ranged guns though are interesting in their own right as well. Finally, for the Abhorrent class knights, we've got the Knight Abominant. Pre-Codex this was the cheapest one at 365 points. It does maybe have a few issues in its melee loadout that's fairly focused against lighter things as opposed to heavy stuff, and the Volkite Combuster that just also seemed kind of lacking for a main lightly weapon. Even with devastating wounds, AP 0 was a bit of a bad thing there. For its damage profile, its melee remains the same, 9 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3 with its Electro Scourge, plus some bonus attacks from the Bale Mace. The Volkite Combuster has been upgunned though, it now gets 12 attacks rather than 9. It's still going to be very swingy as to whether or not you get lucky and roll some 6s on the devastating wounds, but that new profile certainly makes it more respectable. Otherwise, its Battle Shock test special rule has also been tweaked as well. At the start of your shooting phase, select one enemy unit within 24 inches. That unit must be visible, but they can take a Battle Shock test. Previously it was 12 inches, though the model didn't have to be visible. Overall, I'd probably say that's an improvement, though I guess it could stop you messing with units that are hiding behind terrain. And otherwise it still has its Warp Storms. At the end of your movement phase, enemy units within 9 inches take some mortal wounds on the roll of a 3+. That definitely doesn't hurt too much for a bit of chip damage as it advances into the heart of the enemy army ideally. Overall, not enormously changed. Nice to see the Volkite just get that little bit scarier for it. and handing out a battle shock test could make better use of the Harbingers of Dread army rule. It might be one to be a bit more tempted by in the Traitoris lance versus elsewhere possibly. I guess it could get on quite well with the Infernal lance melee option. That seems fairly useful for the Electro Scourge being able to punch up against tough stuff, potentially with lethal hits as well. Finally, we have the Knight Tyrant. This one was 480 points pre-Codex, and even amongst the Titanic Knights tended to be a bit on the overshadowed side. Definitely having some big scary guns, but just nowhere near as well supported as the Imperial Knights with their Knight Castellan, and as a result was regarded as one of the weaker ones. This one does have a different stat line to the rest, only 8-inch movement, so slower than the Abhorrent class. It's got 28 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save now, so again 4 more wounds than it used to have, though it doesn't have a 2+ save and it's no longer toughness 13. Overall, between all that, it does seem easier to kill than before, and maybe the points will go down as a result. For its weapons, it's all covered in guns. You get the choice between the Desecrator cannons and the Geist Strike missile launchers on top. Both of those are interesting enough in their own way. It gets a pair of melter guns, and then beyond that it gets the choice of either the Castellan pattern or the Valiant pattern. The big long-range one takes the Ectoplasma Decimator and a Brimstone Volcano Lance, so a big plasma that's scary against enemy infantry, and then the Volcano Lance that's just ruinous to vehicles, D3 shots at strength 20, AP 5 and D6 plus 8. Could be quite nice with that Tzeentch enhancement to allow you to do some free command point rerolls. It could be really nice on both the attacks or a failed wound roll or something. The Plasma Cannon gets you D6 plus 3 shots, or at strength 9, AP 4 and damage 3 on the overcharged profile. It looks like it gains an extra pip of AP there. Previously it was AP 2 and AP 3 on those profiles. Otherwise though, you can field it in the more Valiant pattern. That one gets the Dark Flame Cannon with 3d6 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2 on Torrent. And then the Harpoons had a serious profile rewrite. It's now only 12-inch range, not 18. You get D3 shots, not just 1. It hits on a 3+, not a 2+, but still at the same massive and scary strength 24, AP minus 6 and damage 12. It still gets devastating wounds, but has lost the anti-keywords, so you won't just be punching through 12 mortal wounds against monsters and vehicles on a 4. That's a need a 6 for that now. And it's also gained the blast keyword too, which means that it's just going to be that bit more effective against small squads of elite infantry and things. Blast would stop it firing in engagement range though. Overall, between all that, the actual big damage potential is maybe a bit scarier for the Harpoon. Getting D3 shots at strength 12 is just utterly murderous. Only having 12-inch range and not being able to fire in melee though are both a bit killer in their own way. It just feels like there's a pretty reasonable chance that if the opponent doesn't want a unit to be in range of that, then they're going to be able to make it so it isn't. It does feel like a major weakness of these guys is if they wind up in melee, they're not going to be able to move and still fire off all their guns, so ideally want to be screened as they're stomping forward. Otherwise the special rules seem to be just the same, while War Dogs are within 6 inches, gain the benefit of cover. Not unhelpful I suppose, though it's easy enough to get that in 40k normally. And then it still has the Bastion of Corruption special rule, meaning that enemy units can't be set up within 12 inches of it. I guess in theory that could mean it's a fairly nice one to hold down a home objective. It could just be generally annoying as it's stomping around the board and not letting, say, certain units deep strike to shoot it with melter guns or other close range stuff. At first impressions, I'd still suspect that the Harpoon and Flamer loadout will be overshadowed by the Volcano Lance one. Overall, the datasheet still seems to be a bit weaker though, just due to those durability changes, making it not quite as hard to kill as it was. I feel like it might have a bit more support in some of the detachments though, compared with what it got in the Traitoris Lance. It didn't get on amazingly well with the Traitoris Lance buffs. Infernal gaining it potentially extra movement is nice. If it doesn't need that, then sustained hits on all the guns is really quite good, and certainly a bunch of the enhancements could be fun enough for this. None of the Titanic ones are prevented from being given to the Tyrant. Overall certainly feels like a bit of a mixed bag this book. Basically at first impressions the Traitoris Lance doesn't seem to be enormously changed, though I feel like with the loss of Diabolic Bulwark it does make it overall feel weaker than before. Pretty much all the other detachments add interest in different ways though. I quite enjoy the idea of the damage buffs from Infernal. Houndpack's got some pretty great stratagems, and the Titanic Lords of Dread one feels like it's got loads of fun factor with those enhancements in particular. The army rule maybe doesn't feel like the best feels good one in the world though. I guess quite a lot of armies might just wind up going for the -1 to hit at greater than 18 inches, and then if it does anything else beyond that, then so much the better. At least you can vary it up a little bit game to game though, if the opponent doesn't have a whole load of long range shooting. I think that the datasheet changes are really not going to please too many people. I think I can see the idea of it to try and make more units be able to interact with the knights in a more meaningful way, and then try and balance that out with increasing wound counts. It does feel like for the War Dogs and the Knight Tyrant, they're just not going to be quite as sturdy on the board as they used to be. And that might well mean that they need to go down in points cost a bit. I feel like there'll be a few more changes that people really aren't fans of as well. The big melter guns dropping down from 24 inches to 18 inches just makes them feel like a lot more of a limited weapon, and War Dogs have certainly got less strong on objectives than they used to be by quite a way, dropping their OC. Hopefully when the points are out and any initial balance changes that Games Workshop have made have happened, this might wind up being overall good for the faction though. It would be quite nice to actually have lists focus around the Titanic Knights more so than just War Dog spam. I do feel like there's some genuinely fun options that could encourage that. The datasheet changes might not be very popular, but with the right points cost, any 40k datasheet can be pretty good at least. If points remained unchanged though, I still feel like the War Dog Carnivore is going to be a pretty central and tempting datasheet for the army. Let me know your thoughts though and initial impressions. It'll be interesting to cycle back to these once we actually get some points costs for the Chaos Knights. I'll certainly look forward to covering them and talking through army tier lists and some army list roundups when we get them when they're back from tournaments. As mentioned earlier, feel free to check out the video sponsor in Melted Minis. They're down in the video description. They can paint up some really fun and fancy Chaos Knights for you if that's something that you'd be interested in. So check out their links, Etsy page and Instagram down in the video description. As mentioned earlier, they do have that fun contest for the Knight Castigator as well. If you want to win this guy, then apparently the draw will be done in 14 days, and all you have to do to enter is follow the Instagram. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, then I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. If you've been enjoying the videos or finding them useful, then you can find that links below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing the occasional video early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.